So this is my mother's side of the family. These are my great-great-grandparents and my great-grandmothers. My great-grandmother immigrated to the United States in 1922. So this might be 1923, 1924, and 1925. So this is Maria Picon Reyes, Jose Reyes, and this is Maria de Jesus Reyes. And so she met my great-grandfather, Antonio Medina, in Indiana Harbor. And he was actually working in the United States in Missouri in 1917 to maybe 1923, 1924, and that's when he came to Indiana Harbor. There's different colonies, and they call themselves the colonies. I don't know if that was a prescribed notion to them. We're kind of pioneers. We're starting off. We're close-knit. So they were living in the Hull House area in South Chicago, Irondale neighborhood, South Chicago. My dad's mother was actually born in South Chicago, and her parents came from Mexico City. And they eventually moved to Indiana Harbor as well. And then Indiana Harbor and Gary. So those were the Mexican colonies. And starting in 1919, there was the National Steel Strike. Before that, you already had Mexican populations working in agriculture and working on the railroad, because as the Transcontinental Railroad, that was starting in Mexico going into the United States. And that's where my great-grandfather, Antonio Medina, started working, and that's why he was in Missouri. He was a section hand. So they were being recruited off of the rail lines and the fields in the United States to work as strike breakers. Northwest Indiana is dotted with at the time, all of Lake Michigan was dotted with steel mills, primarily Inland Steel, which is now ArcelorMittal. Single men came to work, they were called solos, came to work in the steel mills in East Chicago. So they were put on barges in Chicago and then literally shipped into Indiana Harbor. So they just kind of went into the back door. So there's always push and pull factors to immigration. And so 1910 and 1920 was the Mexican Revolution, which was huge. So Mexico was independent from Spain for about 100 years at that point, and so they were still operating in some of the ways when they were occupied by Spain. And so they were shedding their colonized roots to become an independent country. And one way that they did that started the Mexican Revolution, was basically land reform, social and class warfare. You had a lot of families who owned haciendas, and haciendas, for lack of interpretation, is a large plantation. They were either agricultural, mining, or livestock, and some were like 500 acres, some were 500,000 acres, and they were basically land grants from Spain that were given to Spaniards to help populate the New World, New Spain, Mexico. And so those are passed down family to family. And so because of these, they were in rural areas, they were huge, and so there was a lot of social inequality, no real chance for upward social mobility. So your family could have lived for generations and died on the same hacienda. So the Mexican Revolution was basically busting up those haciendas and changing land reform and a lot of other things related to becoming, what we know as modern day Mexico, because the Constitution changed as a result of that. So you have a lot of solos who are coming in who are coming in already into an already existing immigrant population. So there was a lot of Southern and Eastern European immigrants in Northwest Indiana. You have a lot of people coming from the counter-revolution of the Mexican Revolution. It was called the Cristero movement. People who have worked on the natural rhythms of the hacienda, getting up in the morning, doing your work, and going to sleep at the same time, to coming to a heavily industrialized area, to making a lot more money than they probably would have ever imagined, and also different kind of work, working in hot and modern conditions. So you see a lot of people coming into Indiana Harbor from the states of Jalisco and Guadalajara. And those were like middle class families. So that would be these folks. So in the 1920s, you have this curious, fabulous mix of people from all different backgrounds, middle class, low class, all coming in, mixing in the confines of Block and Pennsy. They were racially segregated into these areas. Nobody would rent to them outside of these areas. So being that this community was politically and economically weak, they began to start their own mutual aid societies, helping to pay for like surgeries or ailments of the community, really to kind of like the community trust for the community. And then there were different social groups that came with that. You still had that, like, the peasant, the haves and have-nots. So the more educated people belonged to, the Catholic Order of St. Joseph. That was like the more like literate And they actually, some of those members there started a printing press, started a newspaper, had a library that they would share information. And then you had other societies like the Benito Juarez, I think it's the Benito Juarez Society, where people said that they were, like blissfully illiterate, but they all had shared their love for Mexico and wanting to preserve Mexican culture. So you just have like a delightful mix of people starting over fresh. And I think the notion was that we are Mexican. We'll always be Mexican first and maybe American second, but then also, maybe there was some hope that they would go back once things settled down.